Okay. Well, I'm going to skip down to our fifth question then. What is confidential information and how do we handle it? Well, I've given you a list of some samples of types of information that we would consider confidential or sensitive, and this is not a statutory term, but we classify it as sensitive or confidential because it's the type of information which, if released, might cause damage, financial damage or emotional damage to someone who could then sue the church for releasing that information. Number one, probably the most obvious, would be credit card numbers and social security numbers. So if you have somebody's credit card information and their social security numbers, that's confidential, sensitive information, because if you release it and somebody misuses it, you could be sued for negligently handling it. Donors' contribution records, notes of pastoral counseling sessions are technically privileged, and a privilege means, in legal terms, that you cannot be forced by a court to disclose that information or to release copies of those notes. It's a formal legal privilege, a protection that the courts will honor. The references obtained in performing background checks on youth workers might be one that might not have hit your list if you hadn't been to the seminar. But if you are screening your youth workers and conducting criminal and other background checks, you need to treat that information as confidential and sensitive and make sure that it is kept in a secure manner. Salary and bonus information for pastors and select staff members. Board of Director meeting minutes with sensitive topics such as pending or threatened litigation, enforcement of church discipline, hiring and termination discussions are all sensitive and confidential information. Quick note, if it is sensitive or confidential information, that means you should keep it under lock and key. There should at least be 2 people with keys in case the first one goes on a cruise. If it's on a computer, there should be password protections for the drives where that's kept. And if it's important, a copy of that computer backup information should be maintained in a secure location off premises. The other question is, if you're handling very much of this information, you really need to have a meeting in which you trace the life cycle of this information, starting with how do we get it, why do we get it, what do we do with it, how do we store it, how long do we keep it, and when do we decide to get rid of it. And you may decide when you look at that life cycle, it's not worth getting. So things like, do we really need social security numbers for a volunteer who's unpaid? Well, maybe, maybe not. In your situation, maybe we're going to use it just to do the background check. Once we do the background check, though, we don't need that anymore, so maybe we ought to shred it. And whenever you shred documents in an institution like a church, you should keep a record destruction log, so that you keep a record of all the documents you've destroyed. You know, you don't say, we destroyed Social Security number 6662222, which you get the idea.
Sarbanes-Oxley actually does require you to have a document destruction policy. And you need to follow the policy. It's not just something you copy off of ECFA's website and stick in a drawer, but that gets posted in your storage rooms. You mark boxes when they are to be shredded or destroyed in accordance with your policy. And if you're interested in getting a good policy, ECFA has on their website has downloadable documents that you can get policies, but you need to adopt your policy and then actually follow your policy. I have one other comment on financial statements. One thing I see particularly in smaller churches is I'll see the salaries broken down where we'll have senior pastor salary, senior pastor housing, youth pastor salary, youth pastor housing. And there's only one person in each of these categories. So you're effectively disclosing, if you're required to disclose financial statements, you're effectively disclosing personal information. And that really doesn't need to be in individual accounts. You know, perhaps salaries is good enough. And, you know, really think about what your financial statements are saying when you look at them. Are they disclosing personal information?
I have one question. What about members' addresses and phone numbers?
Question.
Should they be confidential?
Should members' addresses and phone numbers be kept confidential?
Within the members and then without.
Good question, and the question is well framed. First of all, should they be protected from other members, or should they be okay to give out to other members but protected from the general public? Well, there's lots of ways to skin that cat. The first problem is if you have members and you're going to have a membership meeting, then you have to make that membership list available to the other members by statute. Now, if you follow my suggestion and get rid of members altogether and just have scriptural members, then you don't have to worry about it. But otherwise, yes. Now, there is no requirement that you give out those lists to the general public, so you can keep those confidential. But then it suggests, I mean, how many churches have church directories with photographs, names, addresses, and all that, and they're freely passed around? Yeah, that's the context, which leads me, it's a great question. Thank you for introducing my next diagram. The context in which you consider some of these questions is so critical. If you have a 50-person church in Springerville, everybody knows all the members' addresses anyway. They know where they live. They had their kids in Little League. But if you're, 12,000 people at Christ Church of the Valley, and somebody's trying to get that list so they can send them all emails to sell them widgets, then that's going to be a different problem. So as I've tried to give you kind of a paradigm, if you will, for working through some of these questions, and that first diagram is publicly accessible documents. Down the left is who is asking. Well, directors, by statute, have pretty much the right to see about everything that goes on in a corporation because they're ultimately responsible for running the corporation. If it's a church member, they have those statutory rights we've described for corporate records. Mm-hmm. If it's the general public, they have no rights unless the IRS gave it to them. If it's the press is no different than the general public. If it's a subpoena, you have to answer it unless you quash it or modify it. So it depends, the answer to your question, should we give them this or that, depends on who's asking, as you can see. Across the top of that chart are different categories of information that are already available to the public or will be made available to the public if you chose to do so. The Arizona Corporation Commission, you can log on the website, read the Articles of Incorporation, the disclosure statement that was initially filed by the people who filed the Articles of Incorporation and the directors, the annual report, the officers, the names and addresses of the officers and directors. And by the way, you are not required to list the home address of officers and directors. You can list the church address. We see a lot of organizations that are unnecessarily listing the home addresses of their officers and directors. You can look at the latest annual report, you can see whether the corporation's in good standing, and you can look at old financial reports, and there will also be disclosures if any of your directors or officers have been bankrupt. You can go to the county recorder's website and find out, look at the deed of trust, Uniform Commercial Code filings. You can go to the Secretary of State's office and look at some of the financial information filed in those reports that Monica was describing earlier. What information is available through the IRS websites or GuideStar, or Guide 1? GuideStar.
Yeah, IRS does not have access, but the IRS returns, once they're filed, the 990s, the 990Ts are filed, are submitted to GuideStar, and that's www.guidestar.org. GuideStar allows each charity to have a section on there where they can upload financial statements, they can upload, the 990s are already there. It allows you to put your mission in, it allows you to add information, and frankly, it's something that's underutilized by nonprofits, particularly churches, because every grantor uses GuideStar. You can look at the tax returns and see what the charity is. So if you are not using GuideStar to your full advantage, but again, be careful what you're posting there. I would not recommend you put financial statements up there unless it's something where you're an organization that relies on grants heavily. They may make some sense. But certainly your mission should be up there, and any interesting information about your organization. So it's another way to provide information to the public.
underneath that chart is a list of the suggestions which my secretary, I said, Betty, we're going to give a talk to the business administrators. Do you have any hints or tips for them about dealing with the Corporation Commission? And other than sending flowers to the technicians once a month, she suggested that you take a look, particularly be aware that you can file your annual report electronically, and that a reminder that the Arizona Corporation Commission does not send you out any reminder that it's time to file your annual report. And if you do not file your annual report, they will eventually revoke your corporate charter. And when you do file your annual report, if you're late filing it, it's a good idea to pay the extra $35 expediting fee so that they will more quickly get you back into good standing. I'm not going to name any names, but there are some faces in this room who are familiar with all those rules.
Yeah, now Bob, you know there's blanks on there for your officers and directors. Now how many of those do you need to fill out?
You are now supposed to list all of the directors.
Not just the ones you have blank spaces for?
Right.
Not just one?
Right.
Okay, let's be clear. I look on some of your, as part of my audits or compilations or reviews, I go look at your Corporation Commission reports and I'm seeing one officer, and I'm seeing one director, and sometimes it's not even a person who's on the current board because somebody copied last year. This is not a job you assign to the lowest common denominator here. This is something that somebody with knowledge of the board needs to be completing, and you know who you are in this room, so.
Okay, no more shaming.
No
I know
more.
you went to a Catholic school, but.
Yeah, I did.
Okay, turning the page quickly here. The next chart is a list of information not available on the internet or other public source. And we kind of went down through a list of the types of information. And you can see it depends, again, who's asking across the top. Have they been a member for 6 months? Well, then they're entitled to the corporate records, assuming they have a proper purpose, etc. Is it a director? They're pretty much entitled to most of it, except the directors would not be available to take a look at the confidential priest penitent records, if you will. That we talked about the general public, they're not entitled to much. Same with the press, court order we talked about. One kind of odd one I learned about in reviewing the corporate statutes, which frankly I'd never come across before, if your corporation makes a payment, or if your church makes a payment under the indemnity provisions, which means somebody got sued and you provided a defense, you actually have to send out notice to the members per ARS 10-3854 and 11621. So if you find yourself in that unhappy position of paying out indemnity charges, you need to take a look at that. Are you listing health concerns and prayer requests on your website? I ran into a little church in Montana that was doing that. They were sending out an email blast with all the health, I mean, they were violating HIPAA from day one. And the prayer requests just were like way over the top. You know, we really hope George's appendix is getting better after the third infection caused by the hospital. And you know, so give some thought to what you're putting on your website, because that converts any of this information from privileged, protected, or otherwise into publicly available. And also a warning about photos of church activities. You're really not authorized to place photograph of a person on your web page unless you have a written permission from them. And there have been cases where a lady who had escaped from an abuse situation with her son, they took a photograph of the son at a youth activity in another state, put it on the website, and the estranged parent found it and came after him, and then the church got sued for posting the photograph. So there are some kind of reasons you might not ordinarily think about why that's important, but you've got to really monitor that distribution of photographs deal. And the social network websites, don't even want to start on that one. That's another topic for another lunch. We do have a policy for that and suggest that you have one if you have a social website, if you're doing any tweeting, if your church has a Facebook page, you need to be really on top of that one.